So hello everyone, I am Laurence Tubiana, I'm the CEO of European Climate Foundation. I'm very happy to be here. I do think, I think we share, because we are here, we share the deep belief that the change that climate change action requires needs really the full ownership, agency, and power of citizens. That's so evident that these changes cannot happen. It cannot be brought up the top down. By the way, the top down is not always very active. So it's good to have the citizen more active and more forceful. And we need a lot of, it's difficult, it's complicated, giving the voice. There are many, of course, attempts and stories and experience in the whole history of societies, how to empower citizens and how the citizen can make eruption in the public space to defend their point of view and to express the voices. So anyway, it's part of a very long history. But I want just to say how important I feel now, of course, have been, so the people who know me, very absorbed into these activities of getting the Paris Agreement on its foot and on it finalized, even if we still have work to do, to see that the problem and the issues and the energy will come from many places, certainly, but it's certainly not only from a top-down approach with government leading. So it's very much because the citizen would define the way to get there, to transform the societies in a world which is greener and more sustainable. And such a radical change. So I think we need the space for citizen and the force of the citizen. How to make this force present, organized, contributing, and being listened to, that's of course a challenge. And nobody has a perfect recipe, but what we can recognize that if we share the knowledge, experience, shows that there is nothing to be afraid of citizen taking the floor. There is nothing to be afraid of citizen even contributing very forcefully to orient the public domain. It's not a contradiction with representative democracy. It's not a way to infringe on government capacities and mandate. It's a way to bring everybody together and bring along to that change. And again, the change cannot be decided from a place and distributed. You know, sometimes when I discuss with my colleagues in government or even in the policy sphere and the political sphere, they say, what are how make acceptable the change to people? And that I'm sure together, because you are here, you cannot accept that. That is a way to frame things, because the problem is not this a change are acceptable, is how the citizens think and anticipate, expect, and shape the futures they want. And so this knowledge network that is now launched, I'm very keen to just to see how much we can help each other. It has to be naturally very horizontal. It has to be trying to bring the good ideas because it's very much needed. And I believe enormously in this particular moment of history, in a way, vis-a-vis this climate action, that it is a necessary step. If not, we will never succeed.
My name's Erica Hope, and I'm the Director for Climate Planning and Laws at the European Climate Foundation. And it's really a pleasure to see you all here. So thank you so much for joining. And it's lovely to see the messages coming in from all corners on the chat there. I will just quickly explain the running order for this session. You will see a few faces today because Knoca is very much intended to be a network, and we have already a really good sort of starting group of people who've been putting lots of energy and effort in to get things started, and some of those will be popping up today, but we're looking forward to involving many more of you in the months and hopefully years to come. So the plan for today is that now, having heard from Laurence, we will have a keynote speech from David Van Reybrouck, who I will introduce in just a moment. And then I will do my best to share some thoughts that Laurence would have shared, or my version of some thoughts that she may have shared. And then we will have a Q&A moderated by Dr. Diarmuid Torney, who I will introduce just before he does that. And then Graham Smith, who is the chair of Knoca, will really sort of introduce the network, and then a bit more Q&A, again moderated by Diarmuid. And then we will hear from two people who have been very much involved, or are actively currently right now very much involved in organising assemblies. Val Vanreybrouck from the Spanish Office of Climate Change, who is busy organising the forthcoming assembly in Spain, and Bjorn Bedsted from the Danish Board of Technology, who organised and facilitated the Danish Assembly. And they will share some thoughts about what you need to think about when you're organising an assembly, and perhaps how they might find Knoca useful. And finally, we'll hear from Graham again for some closing thoughts. So please feel very free and encouraged to share your thoughts and questions in the chat. And we look forward to a really good exchange, and hearing from some really good thinkers in this space. But thank you again for joining. And without further ado, I would like to introduce David Van Reybrouck, who is known to many in the democracy world and beyond as an author, in particular in this context, the author of the seminal work Against Elections. David has many hats. He actually read archaeology and philosophy at Leuven and Cambridge, and he says that digging and thinking remain his main activities, as well as writing, I think. So as well as writing non-fiction and plays, David in 2011 launched the G1000, which many here will be very familiar with. That's a citizen summit and an organisation that now functions as a platform for democratic innovation in Belgium. And he's also a sort of founding member of FIDE, the Federation for Innovation and Democracy in Europe, which is also a founding member of Knoca. So David, with great pleasure, may I pass over to you? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica, for these kind words, and good evening to all of you, or good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. It's not just an honor for me to be here tonight, Erica. It's also a bit of a relief, because finally, at last, two worlds are coming together that have so much to tell to each other, and it's the worlds of climate action on the one hand, and on democratic innovation on the other hand. And this match, I believe, comes none too soon, for we are living in very, very strange times. We all know that the situation in terms of global warming is critical, and so do most governments. We all know what to do, and so do most governments. And yet, why then does it seem so incredibly difficult to turn awareness into action? Why is it so hard to get successful climate governance on the rails? Why is it so notoriously difficult to reach this stage? And in particular, if you look at quite a number of governments are under immense pressure these days to do something about global warming. There are pressures coming from above, from below, and from aside. If I think of a number of European countries, there are pressures from the European Union, from the United Nations, from above. There is pressure from below, from citizens taking to the streets and teenage activists getting very angry at other generations. There is pressure from aside when judges are condemning national governments for their lack of adequate climate action. I'm talking to you from Brussels. This is where I live. In this city, in this country, last week, a court condemned the Belgian state for lack of adequate climate action, even for committing crimes against human rights. All these pressures are there today, and yet this is still not enough. Why is this? Part of the answer probably comes from what a former Belgian minister for the environment once said in a rare moment of political honesty. He said, and I quote him, "Every climate minister knows what to do against global warming, but none of them knows how to be re-elected afterwards." That's quite a phrase. But it means that the problem is not only one about climate science, and it's not only one about climate action, it is also one about the way we do democracy. It is also one about the difficulty and the problem with electoral democracy. It turns out that the short-term logic of an electoral model makes it very hard to establish long-term policies in terms of climate change. Put simply, it's very hard to work at 2099 if you have to win the elections of 2024 as well. So it's none too soon that experts on climate policy and experts on democratic governance and democratic innovation come together tonight. We absolutely need to join forces, and I'm very happy that Laurencetubiana just used the word joining forces in her introductory words. In my part of my talk, I'll be talking about the democratic part of that equation. Laurencetubiana was going to talk about the climate part, but luckily Erika has been so kind to step in and to speak on behalf of the European Climate Foundation. There are 4 ideas I want to share with you in the next couple of minutes. I'll be very brief. The first one is a rather pessimistic one. Democracy is losing altitude meters. Secondly, like climate scientists, political scientists have been waving with good solutions and good ideas for almost 40 years. Thirdly, some countries are working with an increasingly crazy idea, and that idea is, let us trust citizens. Fourthly, finally, we need a new Trojan horse. No, even Troy needs a new Trojan horse. So let me run through these 4 ideas with you. Democracies are losing altitude meters, for sure. It suffices to have a look at the annual reports published by organizations like Freedom House or The Economist or the Democracy Barometer to see that the number of full democracies has been diminishing for more than a decade now, almost for 20 years. The last title of the annual report of Freedom House was Democracies in Decline. And The Economist was talking about a very bad year for democracy when it was talking about last year. We are seeing 2 developments. Established democracies are getting weaker and are suffering from what I've called in previous writings the democratic fatigue syndrome. Weaker democracies are perhaps even turning into illiberal democracies, post-democracies, or even elected autocracies. And the symptoms of these processes, of this democratic fatigue syndrome, are numerous. Mild symptoms include the fact that less people go to vote, less people are a member of a political party. The electoral fever seems to have become permanent. Forming a government has become more difficult. All these are rather mild symptoms. Severe symptoms include the fact that anti-democratic parties are growing at an alarming rate, together with the growth of polarization, both online and offline. We witness the loss of pluralism. We witness the loss of civic liberties. We've seen increasing attacks on democratic institutions like courts and media. And we've seen switches to elected autocracies. Overall, democracies now are less legitimate and less efficient than they were perceived to be, let's say, 20 years ago. And all of this leads to less trust among a lot of citizens, and especially among the young. This is worrying. If younger people do no longer believe in democracy, we have a problem. But perhaps they do not longer believe in one particular form of democracy. So what we are witnessing is, at the one hand, a planet that is warming up and a love for democracy that is cooling down. That's my first point. Second idea, like climate scientists, political scientists have been waving with alternative solutions for decades. Actually, since the 1970s, and I'm very happy to see from Germany Dr. DNL with us, because his father has been one of the key persons, one of the real pioneers in the 1970s to believe that citizens had something to say. About the same time that the Club of Rome released its famous report on limits to growth, people in Germany, in the United States, were pushing the idea, were exploring the idea that citizens had something to say in between turns of elections. Classical representative democracy, people thought, can be strengthened by using citizens' assemblies. Mr. Dinel's father was calling it planification cells. And over the past 40 years, political scientists have been telling politicians, do not only go after your citizens' vote, go after their voice too. Be interested in what your citizens have to tell you in between two turns of elections. Do not just count votes, listen to their voices as well. And the best way to listen to these voices is to avoid that the same people are getting a power to speak time and again. And the best way to make sure that everyone has the same chance to speak would be to create random samples of citizens, bringing them together, using random selection to create representative samples of societies, to create mini publics, mini Americas, mini Germanys, mini Denmarks, mini Belgiums, mini Brazils, bringing these people together who can talk on behalf of a broader nation. If in the classical electoral democracy, one person has one vote, in this alternative model of democracy, this complementary model of democracy, the idea becomes one person has one choice to be drafted by lot and become part of a citizens' assembly. So this is what people have been saying for over 40 years now. A lot of research has been done, and I see amongst us tonight a number of the experts who have done groundbreaking work in terms of what has been called deliberative democracy, a way to strengthen classical representative democracy. Create random samples of citizens, bring them together for a couple of weekends, make sure they can get information, make sure they have time to deliberate, make sure they have moderators to help them come to recommendations for their governments. This has been going on. Third idea, this idea has not been restricted to political scientists. Some countries have started to explore the crazy idea that citizens perhaps can be trusted. Ireland has been perhaps the most innovative electoral democracy in the past 10 years, when the Prime Minister has been calling for citizens' assemblies in order to prepare constitutional change on issues like same-sex marriage and abortion. 100 Irish citizens have been drafted by lot to come together in Dublin 1 weekend per month for a period of 6, 7, 8 months to talk about a number of these increasingly difficult topics to talk about just within the system of party politics. These lay citizens, these everyday people helped to unlock the situation on same-sex marriage and abortion in Ireland. In Germany last year, this year, innovative processes have been taking place with citizens drafted by lot on the role of Germany in the wider world, and recently on the role of what Germany could do about climate change. France, and I was hoping Laurence-Tubiana was going to talk about it, but we'll be hearing more about it certainly. France has played, I think, a spectacular role with the Convention Citoyenne pour le Climat, the Citizens' Convention for the Climate. 150 citizens drafted by lot coming together for a period of 9 months to come up with 149 recommendations for French climate policies. Impressive. On a much smaller scale, but interesting because it has become such an institutionalized feature of its political architecture, is what has been developed in the German-speaking part of Belgium. Very small part of Belgium, only 80,000 inhabitants, absolutely tiny, the smallest federal entity in the European Union, but it has become the very first place in the world where next to the elected parliament, you have a chamber drafted by lot that is there on a permanent basis and which being refreshed time over again. And it's great that they are there on a permanent basis because these citizens do not go home after a citizens' assembly. They stay there. They are nagging their politicians to make sure that recommendations from citizens are being taken seriously. And so these are interesting developments. And I know it is not easy for politicians to let go power. It is not easy to trust citizens. And perhaps it's not easy for climate scientists and climate activists either. It seems like a long way. You know, the detour via regular everyday citizens seems like a lot of time, but it might be one of our best ways of winning time. Fourth idea, we need a new Trojan horse, and this is the final idea I want to share with you tonight. Because the three outside pressures, the ones from above, below, and aside, we have now, these three external pressures on national governments, they are not enough. We need a fourth pressure, and this time an internal pressure. We need to get citizens inside. Why? Because they don't need to be re-elected. They don't perhaps have the same competences as elected politicians, but they have one bonus. They have freedom. They don't need to run for election or re-election, and this really helps them. They are willing to carry the weight of their recommendations. They dare to go further. They dare to go faster. We need a new Trojan horse. Troy itself needs a new Trojan horse. Climate assemblies, I believe, are one of the few remaining tools we have left to do something genuine and something ambitious about climate policy. Climate assemblies might become the future for climate action, provided they are done well. We cannot afford ourselves to screw this opportunity. We are living through a surge of deliberative democracy. We see more and more climate assemblies. We see more and more citizens' assemblies. This is great as long as they are done properly. So it's really my hope that this Knoca, this knowledge network, will really become a haven, a resource, and a tool for all those trying to do this right, because we will need all the knowledge we can get. Thank you so much, Erica. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, David. That was fascinating, and I think really gratifying, of course, to hear that somebody who's so embedded in the movement and the thinking around this sees the need and potential benefit for Knoca. And I think lots of food for thought there in your four ideas. Yes, I see applause there in the chat. It's not quite the same as being in a room, but what we'll do now is I will share some thoughts, and then because we're a bit behind time, we will actually move straight from me to Graham, who will introduce Knoca, and then at that point we will have a Q&A moderated by Diarmuid. So please do keep your questions and comments coming in the chat. I can see that there's some really interesting ones there already, but yeah, please carry on. So yes, at this point, I do my best to kind of represent Laurence in giving the other side of that sort of story that David was talking about. I mean, he already shared quite some important thoughts about why climate needs this kind of democratic innovation, but to say a little bit more on the climate side. 6 years ago, we, and in Laurence's case, even her quite personally, managed to persuade world leaders to adopt the Paris Climate Agreement. And this committed them to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, as I'm sure we all know, and to try to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. And this change requires a scale and a timeline of action that is hard to imagine. I think to reach the levels that are required will require very deep structural transformations, not just in the way that we produce our electricity or how we make things, but also in how we move and how we eat and how we heat our homes. And these are changes that can be very positive, but they will really require a lot of commitment and investment and understanding. And so far, we are making a start on this, but just as a sort of point of reference, in order to reach the 1.5 degrees goal, the UN Environment Programme called for emissions reductions of 7.6% every year between 2020 and 2030. And the greatest recorded annual drop in emissions of 6.4% was last year by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the one before that was 5% with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you see, we really have big changes that are going to need to be made. And there are encouraging signs that this can be achieved, because to look on the bright side, the reality of climate change and its impacts have risen in prominence in public discourse, of course, partly for the not positive reason that we already start to see some of the changes. But important long-term goals have been set by policymakers, and we do really start to see really important technological breakthroughs which are addressing some of the trickiest challenges. Many countries have set themselves legally binding goals to reach climate neutrality, and they're really intensively trying to work out strategies to achieve that. And we also have positive examples like the Paris Agreement resisting the sort of stress test of the Trump administration pulling out. And meanwhile, we have millions of youth across the globe who've been really mobilizing in a most impressive way to try and get their sort of elders to wake up. And so while all of this is good in terms of a framework and a certain momentum for action, we have to admit that we really have a deficit in terms of political buy-in and public support for the sustained implementation of the actions and the policies that will be needed to really make those transformations. And of course, this buy-in and acceptance is what will make the difference about whether or not we meet these climate goals. Just to sort of illustrate that a little bit, first of all, we shouldn't overlook that there are some very, very powerful groups that have a strong interest in resisting change, while other less privileged groups that would actually want to take forward climate policies are deprived of the power to do so. And this speaks to some of the things David was saying. And secondly, although a large share of the emissions reductions that have happened so far have been achieved thanks to changes that citizens don't directly feel, things like switching from coal to gas for electricity production. But as we move deeper into the transition, the needed shifts are going to be much more intrusive. We may be asked to change our boiler or to change how we move around, or certain products might cost more. And of course, some of these changes will be felt very much more by certain groups of society and consumers than others. And we must absolutely find ways to address these issues of distribution and social justice. We only need to look at the LFS movement in France, which provides a really clear and vivid example of how climate policy can become quite easily a lightning rod for social discontent if it's not carefully managed, and if there isn't that attention to try and bring people on board. And of course, in a post-COVID world, with the consequences of the economic impacts of that unfolding, we may also have some additional social policy dilemmas and eventually more political reluctance, or at least lack of political attention to pass strong climate policies. So this is, in a sense, a crossroads that we find ourselves at. We have to transform high carbon economies and individual behaviours, but this can only be achieved if our democracies work. And as we heard from David, there are many ways in which they do not. I mean, to quote Professor Blondiot, who was involved with Laurence in the French Climate Assembly, he's talked a lot about the deconsolidation of democracies, where we see a sort of discontent and a disengagement from traditional forms of democracy and all sorts of manifestations of that. At the same time, and more encouragingly, as David mentioned, we do also start to see this rising sensitivity to the idea of ownership and involvement of citizens in public decisions in Europe at various levels, and indeed outside of Europe as well. And the use of citizens' assemblies in a variety of countries and at different levels of governance is a really, really promising development. In particular, I think that we see assemblies giving an opportunity to bring together diverse actors and their communities and their perspectives and their experiences as business people, as students, as transport workers, as homemakers, to share and exchange in a process of deliberation to sort of understand and shape recommendations for policies that might be adopted. And Laurence for sure would have shared some thoughts from the French Assembly. So I think we'll have to find another opportunity for her to do that. But I mean, in short, I think we can certainly observe, while of course there's still things playing out from the French Convention, we can certainly observe that it has proved to be very transformative for the participants. That's very clear, and as many of you know, the 150, the participants have really organised themselves to follow up in promoting the recommendations and so on afterwards, which is a really lovely example of how strong the effect can be of taking part in such a process. The recommendations themselves that came from the Assembly were extremely consistent and inclusive and ambitious, and really an impressive set of work that tries to find a balance between incentives and obligations and between ambition and social justice. And so that in itself shows the quality of the work that can emerge. And then what could have been an expert-only debate and often is seen as an expert-only debate has really had enormous resonance. I think polls showed that 7 out of 10 French citizens heard of the French Convention and have demonstrated a strong will to support almost all of its proposals, and there's really been a wide approval of what came out. So that's just one example. There have been many others that are very impressive, and during Knoca's work we will hear about more of them. But I think just to say, you know, these processes are one incredibly important example of how we can start to try and solve this problem, or these problems of the climate crisis and the democratic crisis. But at the same time, there are many questions still to be answered about them. We're still very much at the beginning of learning how to do them. So questions like, what's the best way to ensure that a climate assembly has a lasting and meaningful impact and follow up? Or how should we design the remit to give the best chance of implementable recommendations? Which information should be given to the participants, and by whom and how? And how regularly should we do these processes, and with which status in society? And also keep in mind that climate assemblies are not a panacea. The democratic toolbox is richer and certainly should be broadened with processes and tools that are being tried out in different places or even remain to be invented. And these are some of the reasons why we decided to set up Knoca, why we need to talk about climate assemblies, and why we thought that it would be good to have a forum to bring everybody together who has an interest and senses the urgency of these questions. And I would really like to thank everybody who's worked so hard to set up Knoca in its initial stages. And that's, yes, a lot of people on this call. And also to thank in advance all of those who are ready to engage on what will certainly be a long, but I think a really, hopefully, fruitful journey of learning and practicing to help eventually people reclaim their power and define the conditions under which we have a chance to mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis. So with that, I would like to pass over to Graham to tell us more about Knoca, the network. Graham, just a little quick introduction of Graham. Thank you. Graham is a professor of politics and the director of the Centre for the Study of Democracy at Westminster University. I'm sure many of you know him. I must say, when we were putting out a call for a convener for Knoca, every one of the applications we received mentioned Graham. So he's obviously very much at the heart of this process. Graham's main research interests are in democratic theory and practice, climate and environmental politics, and the third sector. And he recently published Can Democracy Safeguard the Future? And we're really honoured and delighted to have him as chair of Knoca, and his skilled handling has helped us to get to today as a kickoff. And then just after Graham talks, we will have a Q&A moderated by Dr. Diarmuid Torney, who is Associate Professor at the School of Law and Governance in Dublin City University. And he was also a member of the Expert Advisory Committee of the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland when it talked about climate. And Diarmuid has been very involved as well in the scoping stages of Knoca and is one of its founding members. So, Graham, over to you. Thank you.
We face, as Erica and David have highlighted, we face two interconnected crises: the urgency of the climate emergency and the dire status of democratic politics. And I think for many of us in this room tonight, in the Zoom room tonight, there's a recognition that climate assemblies are one way of bringing the wisdom of everyday people into decision making to break the deadlock on climate action, and at the same time to be part of the reinvigoration of democratic politics. As David mentioned, there's been 50 years of practice with deliberative mini-publics, but I think it's fair to say that it's in the last few years that the experimentation with climate assemblies has taken that practice to new levels, not least with the national assemblies that have happened. And in Europe, there are, as well as far as I know, 8 national assemblies that have dealt with climate change in the last few years. See if you can remember them all. And there's been numerous local climate assemblies and citizens' juries. In the UK, which I'm most familiar with, there's been at least 15 in the last 2.5 years, and there's going to be more to follow. And there are people on this call who are actively working on the idea of a global, on the idea and the practice of a global climate assemblies. So, given this practice, Knoca has been established to ask the question: what lessons can we learn from this first wave of climate assemblies and previous assembly practice that can inform better practice in the future? What can we learn from the different political contexts within which these assemblies have been established? What can we learn about the different remits and the expectations they've been asked to, and the expectations that have been set, the kind of different tasks, whether they've been dealing with different aspects of mitigation or adaptation, or whether they can deal with questions of systems change? How can we make sense of the different governance arrangements that have been put in place, the different approaches to climate knowledge and to witnesses, the different facilitation techniques we've seen, with some using much more sort of active facilitation and others leaving citizens to self-organize? How can we make sense of the different ways that they've developed and produced recommendations and the different links that have been established to the policy process? And last but not least, how can we think about the different communication strategies and the ways that climate assemblies have been part of a broader ecosystem of engagement? What we know is that there is growing knowledge and expertise amongst policymakers, amongst practitioners, amongst academics, amongst civil society actors, and importantly, amongst members of assemblies. But that knowledge is diffuse. That knowledge is held in different places by different actors. And so Knoca aims to bring together that various expertise from across deliberative democracy and across climate governance to explore the challenges in designing and applying climate assemblies, and to promote best practice for those who are organizing and advocating for climate assemblies. Climate assemblies are only one way of doing engagement around the climate crisis, but at this moment in time, they are a significant approach, and one that both democratic activists and climate activists are putting a lot of faith in. And I think that's the reason why, at least in its early days, Knoca is going to be focusing particularly on this model. How are we going to do this? Well, we're going to do it through a series of events, such as workshops and learning calls. And the first one we're going to hold in the 6th of July on Scotland. I'll talk about that at the end. We'll be collating existing research and evaluations. We'll be engaged in collaborations and, where resources allow, commissioning research. So, for example, we commissioned 4 draft papers, which we'll be discussing tomorrow, on aspects of framing, of integration into policy, of impact and resonance. And we'll be collaborating and hopefully commissioning training for those people who want to take forward climate assemblies. But not all of this can be centrally driven by a small management committee. These have got to be the activities of a network that co-designs, that collaborates, that figures out together how we can establish the kind of knowledge base that we need over the coming weeks and the coming months. This is a really exciting development, and I'm honoured to have been appointed to be chair of Knoca. It's great to be working with the European Climate Foundation, with the Danish Board of Technology, and with Climate Outreach. And it's going to be really exciting working with you over the coming weeks and months to think more carefully and creatively about how we can bring the wisdom of everyday people into climate politics. So thank you again for inviting me to take this position, and I really look forward to working with everybody.
Graham, thanks very much for those remarks, and thank you also to Erica and to David for their interventions earlier. As Erica said, I'm Diarmuid Torney, an associate professor in Dublin City University, and I've been charged with the task of moderating the discussion we will have now. We have about 10 minutes for discussion on those first three presentations. So I've seen some questions coming in. Please keep the questions coming into the chat box. I'll kick things off with a very interesting question I saw from Najma Mohammed from the Green Economy Coalition, who made, I think, a really important distinction between citizens' assemblies, climate assemblies, as a means of engagement versus as a means of giving citizens agency, of empowering them. In a climate context, I think this manifests itself in the two alternative ways of viewing climate assemblies. One, in terms of trying to get citizen buy-in versus enabling citizens to shape the kinds of climate policies that they would like to see. So could I ask all three of our contributors so far, David, Graham, and Erica, if any of you would like to come in and reflect on that topic, where you see Knoca and your own position on that question. Graham, maybe?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's a really interesting debate to be had at the moment. The way I read that question as well is a really interesting debate to be had about the extent to which these bodies should be empowered. And I'm probably more on the progressive wing here, thinking actually there's good reasons for thinking that these bodies could be empowered, but I also recognise that in some political contexts that's not going to be the case. So I think one of the things that Knoca really needs to explore is the sort of willingness of politicians to cede power, and to think really carefully about how these different types of bodies can sort of become, I think for me what's really critical, become more permanent and more familiar parts of the policy process.
David, would you like to come in?
I think this is the question. It's a recurring question when we talk about citizens' assemblies at large. It's the question about the mandate. Which mandate does the Citizens' Assembly, or the Climate Assembly in particular, have? And I think different forms of mandate are imaginable, but it's only key. I think the crucial idea here is that whatever you promise beforehand as an organizing government, make sure that this is what you stick to afterwards. The worst way of screwing things up is promising citizens that everything will be taken very seriously and then doing nothing with it. I mean, even if it's only on a very initial, very prudent form of exploration of ideas, as long as citizens know that this is their role, it's fine. At least the deal will be clear. But promising something on which you cannot deliver in the future will be weakening the trust in democratic institutions even further.
Thanks, David. Erica, would you like to comment on that question?
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting question, and I think very much agree with the others that the commitment from governments to at least listen and take seriously the recommendations and respond to them, whether or not they end up being implemented, although of course being implemented would be good in many ways, in many cases. That is important to have that taken, that sort of seriousness and this sort of rebalancing of power, of whose voices need to be heard. I think as well, there are other important ways that need to be explored to have citizens holding governments to account, and there's things like civil court cases that like we start to see in many countries, and actually making sure that citizens have the right to do that are other parts of the democratic toolbox, as have been mentioned, that I think will need to be explored. But yes, absolutely.
Thanks very much, Erica. Becky Willis has asked a question pointing out that there's a lot of buzz around climate assemblies at the moment, but also noting that an assembly is not the answer to every climate issue. So her question is, how do we advise on the best deliberative tool for the job? Graham, would you like to comment on that?
Why did I know that Becky would ask such a difficult question? I think it's a really critical question. There is a sense at the moment that climate assemblies are the answer to everything, and I think that's actually something that's really critical for Knoca to actually begin to unpack those questions about when is a climate assembly the relevant instrument to use, and when are other deliberative approaches the right approach. So I think that's got to be something that's got to be one of our key questions as a network as we move forward.
David?
What we see now is that climate assemblies that are being organized on a national level are often unique processes with a very vast agenda. And we've seen, for instance, in the French Convention Citoyenne pour le Climat, where it took place once over a long period, but with an incredibly vast remit or task. I'm wondering whether that is the only possible way. I would love to see a French citizens convention on the climate every year, dealing with 5 or 10 topics rather than 149 as they did now. And I think if we really want to weigh in on traditional levels of power, having one fancy fair of political participation will not be enough. I mean, no matter how well it is done, and I admire the work that has been done in Germany, France, and the work that is going to be done in Spain soon. I think it's fantastic. But if you really want to weigh, we will need to do this on a more frequent basis, even on an institutionalized basis. That was why I mentioned the project in German-speaking Belgium. It's tiny, but it's the only place where it has become part and parcel of the institutional architecture of the polity.
Erica, would you like to comment on that question?
Only to say that this is why we've set up Knoca. Answered Becky's difficult questions and others, and we are trying to bring together the climate and democracy communities, and you can see that it was an ignorant climate organization that called it the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, not thinking beyond the other the other processes that might be involved. So yes, I think Knoca hopefully will help to answer this, and fully agree also from what I've learned so far about the need, as David was just describing, to make sure that these are integrated and institutionalized for a more regular follow-up.
Thanks, Erica. There's a question from Jessie Worker from WRI, which is more specifically focused on, I think, the work plan of Knoca. So maybe Graham or Erica might be best placed to answer this. And it's around whether the research briefs or other research has addressed how climate assemblies have mitigated the impact of misinformation on climate impacts and solutions, and how we bring in the question of values into the work. Graham, would you like to try and answer that one?
I'm really being put on the spot at the moment. Oh no, this is I want to say that we need to co-design and collaborate on ways of working out how to answer these questions. But yes, the first paper that is being written on framing actually starts to tease out some of the issues around values. The issue about misinformation, I think, is obviously a really interesting one, and I think that sort of gets at the dual role that people expect of climate assemblies, which is one, for them to be a place in which recommendations are made for policy, but also this expectation that they can play another role in the public sphere in terms of changing everyday people's views who haven't been part of the assembly, and having that role in bringing in challenging disinformation. And certainly in the US, where they've used assemblies as part of the initiative process, the referendum process there, in order to provide information, they've certainly been used as trusted information sources. So that is one potential use of a climate assembly. It isn't one that we've particularly seen at the moment, I think, but it's certainly one that could be developed.
Great, thanks very much, Graham. We've run out of time for this particular discussion, but of course, this is just scratching the surface, and this is the start of a much longer conversation that will continue tomorrow, and also in the context of the work of the network. So with that, let me thank David and Erica and Graham for their contributions and their engagement in the discussion, and I'll hand back over to Erica at this point.
Thank you very much, Diarmuid and Graham and David, for your very interesting answers, and to everybody for the great questions. I can't really read the chat at the moment, but I'm very much looking forward to saving it and reading the comments afterwards. So the next thing that we will be doing is to hear from two people who are deeply involved in assemblies, and this, I think, is very important because we really want Knoca to be both a forum for gathering and sort of structuring experiences and best practice and research and so on, but we also want it to be a forum that's directly useful to policymakers and to those commissioning and running assemblies, and useful in terms of the practical resources it might provide, the discussions, the access to the top experts around that may be able to offer them advice and so on. So to sort of understand a little bit how the network might be helpful for people in this position, we are very lucky to be able to hear tonight two contrasting perspectives, or maybe complementary perspectives, to help us understand a bit what it's like to be in the hot seat of organising an assembly, and what do we know, what do we still need to reflect upon more, what needs to be further researched, and what they need to help them in that position. So Val Venera's office is in the middle of preparing sort of the next big climate assembly that we're waiting for in Europe. Spain has very recently adopted a climate law that sets ambitious goals and plans for its ecological transition. And the assembly is foreseen to take place this autumn with 100 participants addressing how Spain can address the climate crisis in a fair way. She will tell us the correct question in a moment, but it's very innovative and interesting one as well, because it will also be addressing adaptation as well as mitigation. So that's Val Venera, and then we also will hear from Bjørn Bedsted, who is deputy director at the Danish Board of Technology, and was organizer and one facilitator of the Danish Climate Assembly that recently concluded, although in Denmark another innovation is that they're now looking at following it up potentially with local assemblies, which I think may be an interesting direction that this work goes in. And Bjørn is deeply involved in Knoca because the Danish Board of Technology is also acting as the convener of the network and providing all of the infrastructure that will allow us to do all these things that we are hoping to do. So I would like to start by asking both of you, when you are a policymaker or an organizer considering an assembly or about to set up an assembly, which are the first questions that you need to answer and the first practical matters that you have to consider? I would like to pass to Val Venera first for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erica. I'm very happy to be here today in the launch of this Knoca network that I think it's going to be very helpful. Let me start with a personal reflection. I am dealing with climate policies since COP5. So if you start counting years, I have been involved in climate policies for 20 years. But I have to confess that the launching of the Spanish Citizen Assembly gives me enormous respect, and this is a moment when climate agenda, and all the climate knowledge that we have already got gets into this social innovation process, into this democratic innovation process. I took a lot of notes from previous speakers. So we are in a learning by doing process in which policymakers need to open up our minds and need to adapt also the way we used to work in order to be success and to cover the expectations that many citizens have put on us. To respond to your question, I think that as policymakers, we pass through a mental process, with many barriers to overcome, as I said, because it's not the common way of working we used to do, but. They are two things that I think that are very, very important. The first one is the timing. When we decided to launch the assembly, and the second question we have made to us is the remit of the assembly, how to manage and how to put the boundary conditions in order to be useful for the society, and in order to have a deliberative process that really gets all the aspects that citizens are worried about, and really gets the sensations or the feelings that people normally express when they are talking about climate change. When I say that, is because we decided to launch it by 2020, when in our climate declaration, but during the process of the law in the parliament, the debate of the assembly was very, very, very common. So the rest of the politicians of the parties in Spain really wanted to have this assembly as a legally binding obligation. So now we have the obligation to do it because this climate law was adopted a few weeks ago. So was the first development that we are going to launch after this publication. So it's very important for us. And the second question was if we are ready at government level to put a space sufficiently open in order to get the debate. I think that the exponential step forward in the legislative framework in Spain in the last 2 years was a very good signal. So we have all the frameworks in place. We have a law with legally binding goals by 2030 and by 2050. We have a law that we said many times that need to be revised by 2023. So we need this assembly also to have more information on citizens' views on that. And we also have the long-term strategy. So we have to merge the short term with the long term, and the assembly, is in the middle of this process and in the middle of the revision. And also, it's a good moment in terms of social and awareness of climate change. Our latest study shows that the Spanish population is not only aware of the reality, is not only aware that is human-induced, it's pushing us to have more ambitious policies. So most of the citizens consulted support the creation of low emission zones in the cities. Most of them support also the banning of products with a short useful life, and most of all also support the banning of the fossil fuels products. So all the elements are on our side. So now the responsibility is it's much bigger than in 2020. So the Assembly presents the opportunity to engage citizens, do it for more ambitions, no, at national level, and to help us in the process of the revision, no, and in putting in place, no, all the actions. In practice terms, that means that all the experiences that we have learning from our neighborhoods are very useful for us. We are the latest comers, the newcomers in Europe, no, for this assembly, and we really appreciate, you know, all the work and all the recommendations, no, that have already been put in place. So we're learning from the do's and we're learning from the don'ts. And we are trying to adapt these approaches to the Spanish reality, because, as you said at the beginning, we also want to put at the center of the debate, if possible, because we are still, you know, designing the assembly, the just transition issues and the adaptation necessities, because we are a very vulnerable country, and citizens, you know, are asking a lot about that. I will stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Valvanera. I think I really like your characterization of the Assembly being in the middle between the short and the long term. Same question to you, Bjorn. When you were preparing the Danish Assembly, which were the first things that you thought about, the first questions you had to answer, and which were the first practical matters that you had to consider? Thanks.
Well, I mean, even before, you know, the more general question would be, you know, are you sure you want a citizen assembly? So I don't think this question was actually asked for the Danish Citizen Assembly. And it's one that's been mentioned also in the chat and in the discussion before. And there are indeed other methods, you know, citizen jury, planning cell, consensus conference, citizen summit, that all might be more suitable for getting the kind of input from citizens you're hoping on. So to comment on that previous question, I would say that, you know, it depends a little bit on where in the policy cycle you are. So if what you're looking for is citizens' views on the choice between already well-defined policy options, maybe, for example, a citizen summit would be a better option. And a second thing to think about is, are you really sure you want a citizen assembly? Because with a citizen assembly comes the expectation that you respond to citizens' recommendations. So are you ready to do that? And I mean, this is where we start more or less with the Danish Citizen Assembly as well. This whole discussion of what kind of expectations can you have to a citizens assembly. So one of the first things you have to do is to manage conflicting expectations from different political parties, from media, from academics, from stakeholder organizations, expectations for how the political system should receive citizens' recommendations, ranging from turning all of them into law immediately to politely receiving them as yet another input for unspecified consideration at a time of unspecified convenience. So that's a difficult task to address, especially when your main concern might well be how on earth to practically organize a climate assembly. But it is a question that will come back to haunt you. So my advice to policymakers is that to listen to this advice from practitioners, although it feels like they might be sticking their nose into matters that they're not entitled to interfere with. So it's a clear and often repeated recommendation to policymakers that they clarify in advance what kind of commitment they want to make to the way in which the political system, both policymakers, public officials, and politicians will respond to the recommendations. Will they be discussed in Parliament? Will there be a written response from policymakers to citizens? How exactly should they respond? And although it is recommendable and desirable to clarify all this in advance, it is not necessarily possible to do so. So one might well have to accept that it will be an ongoing discussion and negotiation to figure out exactly what kind of role a climate assembly should play in a certain policy context. And in Denmark, I think it is fair to say that this role is still discussed and negotiated, both in the public and in the less public space. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem, because it clearly takes time to align all these different expectations. And I think it is democratically healthy to see this as a work in progress. The Danish Climate Assembly will have a second phase this fall. And I think the administration and politicians are now reflecting on how the first phase here in the spring went, or last fall in the spring, and to see how they can adjust the coupling between the Climate Assembly and the policy system.
Great, thank you, Björn. Some very practical and I think sort of heartfelt, specific advice there, which I'm sure is appreciated by some, and interesting because I think in the UK as well, we also see quite an evolving situation of different ways in which the assembly is being followed up and used, not all of which were necessarily foreseen at the beginning. We have a couple of questions in the chat. And I think it maybe was a specific question to Spain, but it's also perhaps a relevant question to ask generally. Question from Erwin Mayer, who is from Mayor Democracy rather in Austria, and sort of echoed by Alexandra Revez. Is the climate goal given, or are the assembly members allowed to define the climate goals, for example, defining a carbon budget for Spain with yearly reduction targets? So you can answer that very specific question, Valvanera, and then maybe Björn, hear your thoughts on the same question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Only to clarify, we are still in the process of designing the assembly, and one of the key issues, as was mentioned before, will be the concrete thematics, to land the debates, in the different sessions. So we have launched in the ministerial decree that was under public consultation a very open question related to mitigation and adaptation, and to how to make a more secure society, in order to get the climate neutrality goal. So our previous idea, we have to go through all the recommendations that we have, all the suggestions that we have already received. There are more than 100, so we are analyzing each of them. And when we finish now with this process, we probably have a new royal decree, because that was the meaning of doing that. So we will change a lot of the aspects that we have already presented to the public audience. So we are, as I said, in this process, but we are thinking about landing the big question that we put as the core of the assembly in more concrete ones. But our objective will be to do it through a public process also. So we would like to ask citizens what are the issues to be discussed under the Spanish Assembly. So probably one of the issues will be the goals or the carbon budgets, and I am also curious, and that's another reflection that we are having in Spain. I am also curious if the assemblies are only have only two directions, citizens, governments, or if we can open it to more recommendations, because we also need the private sector to do things in order to get ambitious policies, and we would like to have a more multilateral process, no recommendations to all, not only not to governments, but this is part of the reflection, no, that we are having. Of course, no, when we finish the process of analyzing all the recommendations, no, and we have the last and we have the definitive test. Now we can talk more on the results and on the issues, no, that we will dealing with.
Thanks a lot, Valvanera. Bjorn, maybe you might, when you speak now, like to reflect on what Valvanera was just saying there about how to include other groups besides the members of the Assembly. But also, yes, just any thoughts from your side on the value or not of asking participants to actually define the climate goals, or more broadly part of the mandate, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, in the Danish case, the mandate was to give input on how to reach the 70% reduction target for 2030. But that doesn't mean that they wouldn't be allowed to up the ante, so to speak, and come with more far-reaching recommendations if they want to. In terms of different kinds of input, I mean, for the Danish climate action plans, the government has been inviting input from different sectors, different sectorial partnerships from agriculture, energy, transport, and so on. And they actually consider the input from citizens as a parallel to that. So, I mean, they are treating it internally in the ministry as one of those inputs, going through it quite meticulously, handing it on the different recommendations to the different resort ministries in order to get their feedback and understand the extent to which they can accommodate some of the recommendations.
Super, thank you, Bjorn. We also have a question from Yves Saint-Omer in Paris, I think, an expert on these issues. He's asking, do you think that reaching a consensus between political parties and the different societal interest groups on the principle of a climate citizens assembly is important? Thanks. Maybe Bjorn, I'll give you that one first, and then Valvanera.
Oh, I'm not so sure. I mean, Denmark is known as a consensus society, so maybe it's a trick question to ask me to say yes, I don't know. But at least I think it's important that they have the conversation. So I mean, it's important that they do try to find common ground. Whether they succeed or not, I'm not sure how important that is, but the closer they can get, I would say, as a Danish person, the better.
Excellent. Valvanera.
It's a difficult one. It's a difficult one. I think that we have reached a consensus that the assembly will be useful and it is necessary because we entrench in a law. So that's the first step between political parties. I think that sharing the main principles that we need to complement the actual participation of citizens in the climate dialogue is also important. So I think that we can share that and we can agree on that. And I also see consensus that there is new voices in the society, no, and there is especially young voices, no, that want to be here and that we need to give us, no, and they need to have a space to do it because in our country, in Spain, we have coordinations bodies and we have organized debates and dialogues with the non-governmental institutions, and we have, you know, the climate change Council, and we have also coordination with NGOs and with other actors at civil society at regional level and with the general administration. So we have organized bodies not to hear the institutionalized no governmental voices. But I think that we need to open a new space to these new voices. No, we are talking about new institutions or Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for Future. They are not organized as the rest of the non-civil society, of the non-governmental institutions, and there is also some consensus on that, no, that we need to open that space, and there is also, you know, a good opportunity, the climate assemblies, to hear, no, the rest of the voices, no, that are not in these conventional coordination bodies with the administration.
Yes. Yes, certainly. I mean, it clearly has been a demand of many of these groups to have these sorts of spaces like citizens' assemblies to put their views through in a more structured way to policymakers. And I think there's many great thinkers in the session tonight, and hopefully involved in Knoca in the future, who have good ideas on how to make sure this inclusion can be as strong as possible. Okay, I just saw a question from Dave Morrison in the chat. How do you design a climate assembly to foreground climate justice along with carbon reduction targets? Goodness, that's quite a difficult one. I think I'm going to combine that with another question that I think, you know, may be slightly easier to answer, because I think Dave's question might be one that actually needs, you know, further research. Thinking to the future research agenda of Knoca, are there any questions that you have been grappling with in relation to your assemblies where you haven't actually managed to find examples from existing practice or other expertise to help you solve them? That might form things that Knoca could help to sort of advance thinking on into the future. And that's going to be the last question before I hand back to Graham. Thank you. Sorry, who looks, Valvanera, go for it, you put your hand up, cool, thank you. Oh, you're on mute, sorry, Valvanera.
No, thank you very much. 2 words on a just assembly or on a just transition society. I think that we have also we have also implemented, no, in a just transition framework, no, along with our climate policies in the last 2 years. And the law also established that the just transition strategy needs to be published and revised every five years. And how we implement this just transition strategy that has been already adopted also. We are going to articulate that through just transition agreements in which we involve the workers, the unions, the companies, and also the municipalities. We have already in a process to close 6 of the 12 just transition agreements, no, that we are launching in the last month. There are 12 installations, no, they are going to close, dealing with coal, and we have the experience that if we advance the problems and if we go directly to talk to the people, no, that are suffering this transition, the results is more positive, no, than if we lack the problem until the end of the day, no. So we need to give, it's a way of saying that, but people need hope, and we need to articulate, no, the new possibilities, no, for creating new jobs with the stakeholders that are involved in the solutions, not in the problem, but also in the solutions. I think that when we start the design of the assembly, no, we were very eager not to have these experiences, no, also in the table. in order to share with the citizens. Then they can debate, or they can recommend another way of doing. But I think that these instruments are very well adapted, and regions and workers are very happy with them. They have to be close, and then they have to become a reality. But we are in the process of doing that. So I think that we can make also the assembly, a just assembly, or with just recommendations, if we advance the problems and if we prevent them to happen, or we put the instruments to avoid a stranded assets, or a stranded society, or a stranded sector or municipality. So I'm happy with that idea. But as I said at the beginning, we are in the process of designing the assembly, and we want to be a step behind. So we cross fingers that we have a just assembly also.
Yes. I know this is very dear to the Spanish government and Spanish society in general, and great efforts are being made. So thank you for sharing those thoughts. Just a couple of last quick thoughts from you, Bjorn, on that question before I pass back to Graham for some closing remarks.
Yeah, quickly on climate justice and fairness. I mean, citizens quickly pick up on that. So, I mean, that is at the center of their discussion. So I think rather than thinking of it as something that comes before the Climate Assembly, it's something that grows out of it, discussions about fairness and justice. About information, missing information, I think, and that's also where I think Knoca can help. I mean, for climate practitioners, there are very long manuals for how to do this and that, and facilitation, go from one group to the other, rules for this and rules for that. But there are not that many manuals for policymakers. What should they pay attention to when commissioning something? What do they need to have a place? What different examples do they have on how to make that coupling between citizen engagement and the policy system? What different roles can climate assemblies play? Because they don't have to play the same role. They shouldn't play the same role in every situation and in every country and at every governance level. So hopefully Knoca can help contribute to that as well.
Thanks so much, Bjorn. Yes, and I think that really interesting suggestion about potentially having some more manuals that are targeted directly at policymakers. It's so interesting hearing from you, and I really wish we had more time, because I also saw some other really super questions coming in about how different communities and youth and also climate groups have responded to the assembly so far, and other things that look super interesting on the chat as well. So we will be saving the chat, and we can share it with everybody afterwards. And there will also be another opportunity to dig into some of more of this tomorrow, which I would now like to pass over to Graham to tell us about and to generally conclude. But thank you so much, Valvanera and Bjorn, for your excellent testimonies. Really a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you.
So it's fantastic that the level of engagement. I've really enjoyed listening and hearing from people. Literally, what's next is literally there is something happening tomorrow. We've got a session on what makes a citizens' assembly work, where we're looking at 4 draft papers that have been produced for the launch of Knoca, and also starting the conversation about setting the agenda for the network. And then on the 6th of July, we've got a learning call on the Scottish Climate Assembly. On Thursday, the Citizens' Assembly, the Climate Assembly in Scotland, is tabling its report on the Parliament. We'll have a session with 3 people who are really key to the Scottish protests, who will talk to us about the context, the design, and the impact of the Scottish Assembly. And on the 20th of July, we're going to have a social gathering where we're going to sort of informally continue this process of co-designing Knoca. This is a really exciting development. I think you can set the amount of times I'm waving my hands about can show you how excited I am. But it is only going to succeed if we work collaboratively and if we work collectively to try and figure out how we can bring the public wisdom of everyday people into climate politics. And I want to end with a cheesy quote, and I'm going to borrow an apologies to John F. Kennedy. Ask not what Knoca can do for you, but what you can do with Knoca. So thank you very much, everybody. It's been an absolutely fantastic evening. I look forward to seeing some of you tomorrow, but I look forward to hearing and working with more of you over the next few weeks and months. This is a great initiative, and thanks for everybody for joining. Take care.